Hello, everyone. My name's Seth Bannon, founder of a VC fund in Silicon Valley called 50 Years, and I'll be moderating this panel. Great talks. I think this will be a pretty interesting discussion because we have a pretty diverse array of perspectives. Min focused on nutrition, Hu on sort of deep tech, food innovation, and Dite on sustainable processes and systems. I'd like to start things off by talking about the problems. So, we talked about this a little. If you basically take any society and go back 50 years, there are things the society 50 years in the past were doing that they just took for granted, that the society 50 years in the future thought was just abominable. And this has been sort of consistent throughout history. And so there's no reason not to think that there are things that we're all doing now that we just take for granted, that 50 years from now, people will think, how could you have done that? So when we're thinking about the food system specifically, what might some of those things be?
Sure. My talk focused on meat. More generally, the food systems have very similar issues. A lot of the food that we buy in supermarkets, even if it isn't meat, is flown from all over the world. You'll notice if you go down to the supermarket and buy some apples, they'll come from anywhere but your back garden. And we have a lot of emissions associated with that with transport. We've also got a lot of pesticide issues with chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the food system has become a big problem in part because of supply chain issues. So if you look at also the amount of variety of food that we think that we actually require, so for bananas being shipped up substantially farther than where it's actually produced. So I think one of the aspects is, how do we have just-in-time type of food production systems where it might need to be more localized, this way of actually integrating local communities in different structures so that we actually have also fresher quality nutrients just on site.
Yeah. I think we'll see that this increasing transparency will just mean that there are so many ways where we are now consuming, like literally feeding our bodies with stuff that has just been created in this horrendous way that we give absolutely no thought to, but thanks to all of the transparency and the digitalization of a lot of tools and apps and enablers, we will stop being okay with that because it will simply just come to our faces much more apparently than it is currently. Because right now we can just shut our eyes and not really consider like these crazy ways of which we're producing at the moment.
Min, you and I were talking on the train ride into Oslo about this divide that exists between medicine and food. Even though the number of studies that show causal correlations between what we eat and chronic health conditions are vast and growing every day. In at least US medical schools, after 4 years, students are taught on average only 14 hours of nutritional training. And so for some reason we've set up this divide between medicine and food. So what can be done to start breaking down that divide?
Yeah, I think that one is that this realization that food is actually, this integrative medicine is actually coming into the forefront. And I think with those types of functions, physicians are actually also now becoming more open to integrating other ideas into their practices. And so, and that's actually looking at more collaboration. So seeing that there's deep areas of expertise from nutritionists, dietitians, and other areas, and actually working with them to manage your patient's health is going to be way more important because we can't expect physicians to actually pick up the area of the entire field of nutrition, but to see how important it is in terms of chronic disease management.
Another thing I want to ask you about, so personalized nutrition has been something that people have been excited about for last 10, 20 years and really hasn't come to fruition. It seems like now with things like genomic sequencing and the ability to analyze people's metabolism and their microbiomes that we might be on the cusp of being able to make something happen. What innovations need to exist for sort of true personalized nutrition to happen?
I mean, I think that's one of the bigger problems of how food's produced today and how we can get it on tables. So one, I think that people in general need to start breaking down their expectations a little bit of the food that they eat. That's actually one big thing because the amount of variety that we want to see on our plates, quinoa from Ecuador or Peru, or bananas from wherever I was saying, is that eating more locally and sourcing that will make it actually a lot easier. But the second piece in terms of the data side is that we're still like nutrigenomics is still a fairly new and novel area. So it's still taking a while for us to understand exactly what your body requires on any given time. So I think in terms of our platform, what we're trying to do is that the foundation for how those nutrients actually map out to the broader food categories will actually enable those industries that are actually delivering meal kits and stuff like that to flourish more. So, our goal would be actually to partner with other food producers and providers in that sense.
So it sounds like what's needed is more education among the medical community and the food production community. Okay, so continuing on the strain of more education being needed, despite the sort of scientific consensus on GMO being safe, being as strong as it is for climate change being real, a lot of people who are consumers just don't believe that. Especially in Europe, there's a huge movement against GMO-produced food. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, that's fun. So in Britain, the general populace, certainly not everyone, but a lot of people seem to have decided around Brexit time the experts are full of crap, which is funny because they clearly know a lot more than the average person. That's why they're experts. So I think I think we basically need champions for various movements, okay? So if you look at what Jamie Oliver's done for Jamie Oliver's a very well-known British chef who's done a lot of work to improve school meals. He'll run a campaign. We need campaigns to show people that GMO is okay. I think I don't know, maybe this is slightly pessimistic, but maybe ultimately we need like the Kardashians to tell everyone that GMO is like the best thing ever. Because you're correct, there's really a million different things that we can do by genetically editing or manipulating, and there are two important differences, our food.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, the sentiment around GMO, when you actually educate people in terms of the history and how we could actually feed the population of the world is absolutely necessary. And, certainly there are things around GMO that could be done better. So when you're talking about gene editing versus, manipulation, they could be done in a more ethical way, with closer to the actual food group, or actually more closer to the biological component that it's altering. But besides that, I think it's a lot about educating the individual consumer.
I think it goes to sort of like a more sort of like mindset structural problem, in the sense that we tend to, as society, be much more focused on the problem side of things as the opportunity side of things. So GMO is now seen from the problem side of things. Climate change is seen from the problem side. It's easier for us in terms of mindset to relate to the problems than it is to the solutions. And I think for all of us in driving this change, one of our key obstacles to overcome in order to be successful is really being extremely good at creating the positive narratives around these things. What can GMOs do to actually save the world? How can it be done in a tangible, clear way? And I think if we achieve that, then it will not be as big a problem. But that's right now we're not very successful at that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like better storytelling.
Yeah.
Monsanto needs to no longer be the face of GMO.
Exactly.
There's no one that despises
Exactly.
that company more than me, but loves GMO tech as much as me.
It's maybe worth very briefly noting why that would actually be a good thing as well. So if we think about all three areas that we've talked about, under the context that GMO is absolutely cool and this is definitely something we do, then that's one of the biggest levers to pull. So animals, for example, could be way more efficient if we edited them a little bit. Similarly with
there's a Danish scientist that is sort of talking about organic MO, sort of like leveraging towards that. How can you actually enable organic farming to happen at a much higher scale without having to use so much land? And maybe you could work with those kind of things as opposed to the current Monsanto story.
So question for you. So in the States, people are not as concerned with GMO, and actually the regulatory framework that got introduced a couple of weeks ago is very reasonable. It basically says any food that you could make through traditional crossbreeding that you make through GMO is automatically approved, which I think is quite reasonable. It's not the case in Europe. What does this portend for the future of cellular agriculture products and companies in Europe?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think if we consider a world in which genetic modification is absolutely fine, then we can massively improve the efficiency of, let's take cows. Cows at the moment have roughly a 25-to-1 input-output conversion ratio in terms of the feed you give them, how much they give you. So if you could hugely improve that, then you basically need less factory farming, you take up less land, you use less water, there'd be less methane. So it's almost as if the need for cellular agriculture sort of disappears, because it is possible to raise cows and all other animals in environments in which they actually enjoy their lives, right? And a really important thing to note about cellular agriculture is that there won't be any cows for the products that we're making. So if we say that life in a factory farm is on average bad, then we want to end that. But if life in a pasture is on average good, then cellular agriculture is not such a good thing. And I think the lever that might control that is certainly one of them is genetic editing.
So I think you did a great job explaining why animal agriculture makes no sense. But Dita, even the way we make food from plants makes little sense. You know, we take plants, we ship them somewhere, we deconstruct them into oils and powders and different waste products, then we ship them somewhere else to be reconstructed back into food. So what are the most sort of important innovations or changes to the system that need to happen to fix that broken system?
I think a lot of it, like, literally is not necessarily so much about the technology side of things, because we actually have a lot of things available right now. It's just simply like this sort of the mindset and designing for it from the get-go. So we actually can do so much just from that. Essentially just putting up those positive constraints in terms of what are we saying, and, you know, we were talking about Noma yesterday, and this sort of like them putting up a creative constraint of how far can the produce be sourced from or not, and like all of these things, and we can scale that up to a global perspective of what is it that we're comfortable with, how far can things go. You were mentioning in terms of as from the consumer perspective, do we want things available at all seasons, or would we be okay with things not being available in all seasons, and really finding ways to do that. And as soon as we have those positive constraints, we can make it happen, because the tech is there. It's just about really seeing the opportunities.
Yeah, and the other thing is, we have to look at how traditionally food has been manufactured over the last 50 years. So when you look at the, it's not even the Industrial Revolution, but really it's post-World War II, that food has completely been changed.
Yeah.
So the way that we manufacture food today is full of preservatives like sugars or fats and et cetera, and salt, because we had to make mass quantities of it for war. And then that became something that was produced just kind of broad country-wise, and then processed food became a norm, especially in American diets. And the kind of massive orders or quantities that you need to actually have in raw materials to actually make a particular food is something that the food industry has been built on.
Yeah.
And I think there's, you know, for example, on the supply chain side, better co-packers and stuff that are working with smaller quantities, where we can have locally produced ingredients that actually are, you know, all done on a local basis. So there needs to be more capability to actually make food on that level as well.
And then all of the, we like celebrating all the great side benefits of that. Like, not if you look at the packaging industry, if you source locally, not having the need to wrap everything in plastics, and sort of, because right now there's good use to plastics in the sense that if you have to transport it from afar, it will last longer in plastic, so it makes sense from that perspective. But maybe turning things around and sort of like, wait, maybe things actually don't need to last that long. That might not be a positive thing if we kind of recode our relationship to food.
So over the past decade, I think we've seen regulators and governments sort of acknowledge the dangers of sugar. And we've seen now a lot of regulatory frameworks that have been intended to reduce sugar consumption, be they just direct sugar taxes or other means. It seems like governments are starting to come around to the ills of meat. You know, the World Health Organization published a report recently saying processed meats are type 2 carcinogenic, causing cancer, and red meat as well. And we see governments and municipalities starting to take efforts to reduce meat consumption. What do you think will be the next sort of categories of food that the regulators and municipal governments start to realize are not good for society and to start to push back on?
That's a good question.
I mean, I can, that's, maybe it's not food category, but I certainly know the regulators are starting to push on many different categories because of the advances, or even with 23andMe and at the FDA. So similar to that, I see that happening in the supplements industry. So when you look at the supplement industry in the States, it's so unregulated, it's nauseating, and that lends to really terrible products without quality controls being put onto market. Actually, is substandard to food products even. So I think wherever there's any lack of regulation is going to be areas, but I definitely see it happening in the supplements industry, which is adjacent to the food industry.
Yeah, and another adjacent, I'm super excited essentially in terms of seeing the regulatory work in Europe towards plastics. I think there's going to be so much happening just within the next year or two that's really going to drive a lot of positive change in terms of innovations within the production of plastic. So that will be very interesting to see. And we'll ban single-use plastics and all of these things that we're just right now so used to having all of these straws and whatnot, and not even considering it in like the plastic cups and all of that. Really, I think we'll have very quickly a quite a hard stop and a sort of change of mindset in that coming in large from regulation.
So it's ever so slightly better in Europe, but if you walk into a 7-Eleven, especially in the States, you might be able to find a banana and maybe a package of nuts, and everything else that they sell as food is almost functionally poison, something that's almost definitely not good for human consumption. And so I'll combine two questions. One, how do we change that and tackle sort of like all the junk foods that people are addicted to? And Min, you talked about how a lot of these foods sort of have these activation points where they kick off our reward centers and cause addictive behavior. Is there a way of using that for foods that are healthy for us? Is there a way of changing foods that are healthy for us to make them as addictive as foods that aren't?
Yeah, absolutely. And so from some of the research that I've been reading on that side is that once you actually start changing the palate pattern over, so from a very sugary palate to a fully whole-based palate, you actually start tasting differently. And so that's one aspect where you can actually start changing taste preferences of individuals, because then all of a sudden, if you switch a person who's eating a whole plant-based, let's say, food diet, to a processed one, they'll actually have an aversion to the food. So actually, even as a Canadian, when I actually went to the States, I noticed that the food is much more sugary, and so I got an aversion to some of the sauces and stuff like that. That's one particular example of that.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that as well, actually. So when you move from one country to another, you find some food that's totally standard, really, really weird. Ultimately, this is just it's a question of either commercial marketing or governmental regulation, right? And a function of how libertarian you want to be. So if you look at the supply push and the demand pull, presumably, well, clearly, the foods that are currently selling are high in demand because this is what consumers want according to their paradigms, their beliefs, and their, what they're used to. So if we as impact-oriented entrepreneurs want to really change that, then we have a responsibility to figure out either how to get the government to tax things that are clearly bad, or maybe less conflict of interest, just how to be better at marketing really good stuff.
Yeah, and actually we see that happening already in a lot of food products. So you'll see most categories of food be actually incrementally better in pieces. So, instead of having gluten or sugar or processed food, it's actually minimized ingredients that are packaged in a more sustainable way, that are now being more prominently displayed. And so I think roasters and retailers are now kind of they're pressured to put those foods at the front of the tills. And so typically, actually just visually, when you walk into retailer shops, the most prominent purchase points are where these junk foods are typically placed, and now they're being replaced by some of these other better category foods.
Yeah. And I think there's local is global, it's an important part of that. You see in Denmark in the 7-Elevens, actually 50% of what's there is locally produced, and sort of moving more towards that, and then again, marketing around that. But I think there's a lot in just growing local. Have the same processes and all of that, but whatever you sell is produced locally. And I think that goes to community building in the sense that we can do a lot. It's difficult to be an individual consumer and create change, but there is a lot of movement building and very powerful movement building, because food is something we all can all relate to. It's something that we eat every day, so it can be a super powerful experience to change your own ways. For me, that was the case. Going vegetarian was a super empowering action for me, and sort of if we can create more of that, I think there's a catalytic effect to be had that will spill over to different things that people are doing.
We have 1 minute left, so maybe 20 seconds each. Two questions. One, what sort of food innovation that people are talking about are you most skeptical of? But because I like to end on hope. Second, what food innovation are you most excited about?
Oh, clean meat, that's crazy, but it's also beautiful.
End with the positive,
and it
please.
might well work.
End with the positive, please. Start with the skepticism.
Skepticism?
Yeah.
Oh, it's crazy. Clean meat.
Oh.
But it's also beautiful. If it works, it's brilliant. So I highly, highly believe in it, but I'm also aware that we have big problems. And I think skepticism is basically a function of like what you believe there to be problems around. So if we can overcome those, then we're full speed ahead. But there are challenges.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great products that I've seen in the market. So even like from algae-based shrimp to, when we talk about alternative types of food, I think it goes back to this issue around how can we use better sources of food that actually still has an incrementally better outcome than what currently exists on the market today. So if that can drive better behavior change on like a larger scale, that's actually net positive.
Great, true founder, no skepticism.
I think like there's so much opportunity, and I realize that, but I'm also having sort of like a slight skepticism. This whole food is not software, so how do we actually work with the tech sphere and do it in a good way and not in a bad way, and make sure that we do that in a regenerative way? And I think there's something to be mindful of there. Something I'm super excited about, because my thing, like my problem from a personal perspective is fish. I really love fish, so it's very difficult for me. And a friend just told me that they'll release a plant-based fish product in a couple of months with crab meat and whatnot. So that I'm super excited about, bringing that back into the diet.
Well, I'm super excited that people are having more conversations around this, and particularly excited that people as capable as the three of you are helping push this forward. So round of applause to our panelists.